Frank, in many Eastern traditions, consciousness is not only critical, but in some, it's the only thing. It's an idealistic view that only consciousness exists. Some Buddhism particularly has that, and some aspects of Hinduism. From Chinese philosophy point of view, as it has developed, what has been the role of this concept of consciousness and pure consciousness?
So it's interesting that Chinese philosophers don't really have an idea of pure consciousness before Buddhism comes in. So we have, I think, an idea that I think is coming partly out of Descartes, but that consciousness is like a container, right, for all of my thoughts, all of my impressions, and that really I'm not, right now, not exactly seeing you. I'm seeing a representation of you in my consciousness, and then I can infer that you're actually outside of my consciousness. So this idea seems kind of intuitive for us coming from Descartes, but that way of looking at the world didn't occur in early China. Like, no one ever thought about that possibility. You could say they thought about consciousness more the way we think about perception. So they thought about it more as a kind of direct relationship to the world, as responding to things in the world. And so perception becomes important for them. But it's interesting that they don't seem to think consciousness is even that important, you know? So that's, yeah, so that they'll distinguish cases where, say, we act in a, well, here's what I'm thinking. They will praise actions where I don't have to think about what I'm doing and I'm not even aware of what I'm doing, right? So you could think about sports as an example. The Zhuangzi gives a famous example of a butcher cutting up an ox. And those are cases where, you know, we're perceiving and we're responding to the world, but we're not necessarily like self-aware of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. They tend to actually privilege those over the situations where we are self-aware, right? And I think it just shows that there's a kind of primacy for them on a responsiveness to the world that doesn't have an important role for our idea of consciousness in something like pure consciousness.
So reflection is less important than engagement.
That's right, that's right. Yeah, and this allows them to think of perception, human perception, even human cognition, on a kind of continuum. So you could think of it from like the way plants, you know, respond to the sun, to the way animals, you know, will, you know, hunt their prey, to our doing things. They tend to see this on a continuum. And it's quite interesting that a lot of their terms for cognition, it's not clear whether it is involving a kind of self-awareness or not. So Xunzi is distinguishing plants and animals and human beings. And the term he uses, that they usually use for like knowing knowledge, he attributes to the animal level. So the animals themselves have that. So that's clearly not like self-consciousness, you know. Right. What distinguishes human beings for him is social organization, actually, not that knowing.
The issue of consciousness, certainly in Western philosophy and in Hindu philosophy is much more so perhaps, is the problem of consciousness. How can it happen with a physical brain? That's one problem. And then the other, then going on from that, is the importance of consciousness in reality. Is it a epiphenomena? Is it a derivative? Or is it the fundamental reality from which everything is derived? But neither of those two occurred in Chinese philosophy.
Yeah, I think that way of framing it just didn't arise. You know, and that's maybe partly because they're not working with a clear dualist system between mind and matter.
Right.
So they're already thinking of mental things as a kind of chi that can interact with physical things. So it's all still part of the same system. It's probably part of that.
Okay, so we don't find that in Chinese philosophy. And then as Buddhism comes in?
As Buddhism comes in, it's very strong, and especially in the forms of Buddhism that come into China. So one of them is, I mean, it's called in Chinese Wei Xin, mind only, consciousness only. It's the Yogacara school in terms of Indian philosophy. So that becomes quite strong, and that's the idea that everything is just a manifestation of consciousness.
Which is a radical difference from the early Chinese philosophy.
It's a very radical difference, yeah. And if you look at the early, like when these are coming in, they're really having to create a whole new vocabulary, even to translate them, to talk about them. So around consciousness within Buddhism, so you have this Yogacara school, then you have critiques of that, and then you have the kind of Buddha nature school, but that also you could talk about as a kind of universal consciousness. The main difference that they make between them is that the Yogacara view on their idea has a dualism between consciousness and the thoughts in consciousness. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But that's their critique of it, is that it's still kind of dualism. And then Buddha mind avoids that. So you somehow lose any kind of subject-object dichotomy at all. And you just have appearances going on.
How does that work? How do you eliminate the subject-object difference?
Their view would be if through meditation you observe, you find, and this is true for other forms of Buddhism as well, you find that there's no subject there that's perceiving the ideas. Yeah. And so, again, that's a common Buddhist viewpoint. But then what is not really the ideas of a subject, right? But that kind of makes them not even quite ideas then, if they don't belong to anything. It's just the kind of way that they try to get at reality without any dualism at all.
And do you have then these two ways of approaching consciousness kind of going on in parallel? In the Confucian Taoism, it never really has any major importance, but it continues with major importance in the Buddhist schools.
Yeah, it gets caught up some in the Neo-Confucian context as well, but never quite on the level of saying that everything is just mind. You get a little bit of, from examining your own consciousness, you find certain principles, right? That's showing some Buddhist influence in, say, Wang Yangming's philosophy of Neo-Confucianism, but it doesn't play the same kind of role.